Thank you. I'm Stacy Sharman. I'm the Programme Manager at DEFRA for the Joint Flood Risk Programme with the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales and the Welsh Government. And as Andy's kindly just set me up there to introduce my talk, I'm going to be talking about how we best move research into practice. So, just to set the scene, I want you to imagine that your project's finished, your paper's been accepted for publication, everything's looking very rosy, you can put your feet up. But I just want to ask you to pause and reflect and think about, is there something missing? Is there more we can do? So research impact means very different things to different people. It's also called knowledge translation, knowledge exchange. All these terms are really getting at the fact that we need to move beyond simple dissemination and communicating findings, but actually try and get to a situation where we actually make a difference and we see some changes. I should emphasise at this point that I'm not saying that the academic route of publications and all that process is not important. Of course it is. I suppose what I'm trying to do is to encourage you to think about different strategies and different approaches in this space. If I could start off by giving you a brief example from the education part of government. There is an anecdote that analysts are quite keen to relate, and it's about a situation in the late 90s where there was a ministerial meeting to look at what should be done for education for preschool children. And according to the story, there was a very thick slide pack that was produced with lots of research findings, analysis, graphs and charts. And one of the people in the meeting picked out one of these charts and laid it on the table and said, what are we going to do about this? It was a chart that showed that children from deprived communities were already behind their more affluent peers by the time they started at primary school. And according to the story, that's one of the reasons why the Sure Start initiative, which is was designed for sort of childcare, education and parenting classes, that's one of the reasons why that was put into place. So I've just listed up there a few different takes on what impact can actually mean and how that can be conceptualised. Clearly changing practice, for example, you know, how you do asset maintenance or monitor assets is one potential change. A change in decision making is also critical. It can be perhaps a change in direction, or maybe more subtle than that in terms of a change of emphasis. Research can have impact through raising new issues, perhaps not new issues, but certainly issues that perhaps are not thought to be central or important in a particular context, and actually sort of bring that to the forefront and more to the forefront of people's minds when they're thinking about policy making. It can also result in a change of direction. So not a radical shift to you know, from you know, black to white, for example, but more of a subtle shift in emphasis and a slight change of what was actually intended. And finally, another area where I think it's really powerful is that these findings can confirm sometimes people's you know, expectations or their perceptions, but also it can change them. So the perceived wisdom or the prevailing wisdom changes and is better informed and it more reflects the reality of what's happening. So I thought I'd start off by thinking about some situations where things didn't quite go to plan, and try and present to you some sort of common themes in that space. The first is around the lack of clarity in the research question. I was involved with a project where there was no consensual agreement at the start about what the objectives were, what the research questions were, and that had a massive impact on the project. not only in terms of delaying the outputs, and that was despite a lot of work to try and come to that agreement at the start of the project. It just meant that the project never fully recovered from that kind of uncertain, unclear start. Secondly, it's possible to ask the wrong question. Obviously, we wouldn't want to do that, but in some situations that does happen. The EA very kindly shared with me a project that was designed to produce and test local warning devices and trial them in a local community. The project wasn't successful, and one of the main reasons for that is that there was an assumption that a technological solution was the right approach, but no one had actually asked the community and consulted with the community whether that was the case. Another key area is around outputs, and outputs that are not well designed or tailored for use. We all know there's a multitude of audiences out there, and it's really important that outputs, particularly reporting, hits the spot. One policy colleague that I've worked with always uses a sort of rule of thumb guidance about whether or not her elderly mother would understand what she was talking about, and I think that's there's a lesson in there for us all, I think. And finally, one other aspect is lengthy and dense reports. I really appreciate, I know that length is a challenge in terms of writing particularly final reports. And there have been some approaches to try and tackle that. I can think of one which is sort of a 1-3-25 scenario, where we have a 1-page of key findings, a 3-page executive summary, and a 25-page detailed report. But clearly that's not going to work in every case. So I thought it'd be helpful to run through steps to achieving impact. Before then, I'll take you through some real-life examples of where there has been successful impact. So the first issue I've touched on already is around the clarity of research questions. If that's not right, then that will impact throughout the project and potentially delay it, and mean that the impact that you're looking for will be very difficult to achieve. Secondly, understanding the context and existing research is critical. It's, I think, one of the most useful things that researchers can do is to really think about what the added value, what the different, the new insights that their research project is going to bring to make the case for why it's needed and how it will help other people. Timeless delivery is another critical issue. Everyone is always working to some form of timetable, depending on how fixed it is. It's really important to bear that in mind, because it may impact on how you structure your project when the outputs are due, and how you approach it generally. Involving stakeholders early on and throughout the project is also a good move. We see a lot of requests for letters of support, and obviously that's one way to get that started. And another approach that's come to prominence in the last couple of years is about co-design between researchers and practitioners, and that's a very fruitful area, and there's some really interesting models out there that be good to see how well they work. Realism is obviously important in terms of understanding how close or far you are to the market. It may not be that one project is going to get to where you want to be in terms of impact, and you may need to be thinking about a programme of research or a follow-on project to make sure that the findings hit home. And obviously it's always good to think about how much change is needed, who needs to take that change, what the mechanisms are and what the routes are to achieving that. And as I mentioned before, quality outputs, appropriate quality outputs are critical as well. So just to run through some examples, The first of which is the EA Condition Assessment Manual. And in this situation, we did have a very clear definition of the problem, because we needed to improve the way we understood the link between visual inspection of assets and their likely performance under load. And again, as in this case, there was a number of research projects that were designed to bring this through into the business. There was some research to identify important asset failure modes by the Flood Risk Management Research Consortium. This was then piloted through in the Thames Estuary project, and some further work done to create deterioration curves and rates. And this information has been used in DEFRA and LTIS. So the outcomes of all that work was that the condition assessment manual was updated and is widely used, and it's now forms part of an accredited training programme. Before I go on, I should just say that I've had to obviously pick out some key examples, and I do apologise if you've been involved in some of the projects that I mentioned and I'm not able to sort of reference your contribution. Okay, so moving on to think about in the coastal context, there was a new industry standard national data set for designing sea levels around England, Wales and Scotland. And this was some work done with SEPIA and key industry partners. It produced a number of outputs and products, and which have been used in a number of ways. Firstly, to feed into operational coastal flood modelling and mapping, feeding into scheme design. It's also been used in strategic planning, including shoreline management plans. It's fed into flood risk assessments, and it's informed key infrastructure development, including nuclear new builds. So it's a really good example of develop something once and use it many times. And finally, in terms of examples, in the sort of more social science space, the Hull Recovery Project, which was led by Lancaster University. And this is a project that was designed to identify and document longer-term experiences of flood impact and recovery. And it used an innovative method where they asked people to write a diary to document their experiences and to record them through that route. And this project used a very had a wide-reaching dissemination plan, including face-to-face approaches, a range of outputs, website and an impact video. And the focus was very much on telling people stories so that people could really directly hear firsthand from people who had been through this situation. They also developed a flood snakes and ladders games, which went down well with policy colleagues, which was good. And in terms of impact, it's fed into a lot of the work that the Civil Contingency Secretariat do, and it's really changed our way of thinking about the impacts and effects of flooding. So, to finish off, I thought I would just reflect on some key messages. So, thinking about impact from the start is obviously a good thing to do. And it's really important to engage and try and establish champions or agents of change, because in my experience, impact is about connecting with people, and if you're able to persuade people to be champions for your projects, they can reach into networks that perhaps you don't have access to or don't have time to access, so they can do a really important job in spreading the message. Complex is not always better. I've just been involved or read a literature review about evacuation, and one of the difficulties with that product is that although it's very short and concisely written, it is written in quite academic language, and therefore I'm struggling to sort of get traction with policy colleagues to get them to take on board what it's telling them. And sometimes it is about the right time and the right place, as in the Sure Start example, but also I wouldn't want to discourage you. Sometimes there are things you can do to make sure that to give yourself a chance that it's the right time. And my final point is just a sort of plea. This stuff is hard. There's no pretending. I wouldn't want to leave you with an impression that it isn't. But if you get it right, you can make a real difference. Thank you.